in their sin. Man calls it a luxury, and God calls it leprosy. You need to go back and do a little studying on leprosy and see how it just gnaws away at the flesh and how it just eats away till it totally destroys the body. That's the way that God talks about sin, how it does a person. Just little by little destroys and takes it away. Man calls it a mistake, and God calls it madness. Man calls it weakness, and God calls it wickedness. Man calls it going to heaven, and God says you're going to hell. Man's got their own way of thinking, got that. There was an old-time preacher years ago, and he would preach on the subject of sin quite often. And as he would preach on sin, and he would identify with it and tell them what it was, and when I first started my own ministry, as I would stand at the back door, and when I first started preaching and preaching against sin and all of that, I would have members come out the door and shake hands with me and say, Brother Wayne, you shouldn't preach on sin. You shouldn't name sin that, and you should just talk about it, but don't name it. I said, well, the Bible names it, and I can read it out of the Bible, and I can name it. And sin is not pleasing unto God. And there was this old-time preacher, and he continually preached. And he preached the Word of God, and he preached on sin, and he talked about how it was an abomination, and how that God hated sin, and how that God wanted people's lives right. And there's a congregation finally come to him and said, look, we don't want you to use these ugly words anymore. We don't want you to talk about that anymore. And the next Sunday, the old preacher come in, and he borrowed a bottle of strychnine and set it right there on the pulpit. Danger. It will kill you. He says, do you want me to change the name on it and you drink it as Kool-Aid? God says, I can't change. God's not going to change. He calls things sin. And we're living in a world today where people don't want to hear the word sin. They don't want to hear that I'm doing wrong. They don't want to hear that I need forgiveness of my sins because they think they're perfect little creatures. They think they're perfect little puppy dogs and little kitty cats running around, and everybody's going to pat them on the head, and they got bows in their hair, and everything's fine. But God says sin is ugly in His eyes. And He says the only way to get rid of that ugliness is to allow Jesus to cleanse our life. And in doing so, He brings us in to a right standing with Him. You see, has that bottle read deadly poison? And danger. This Bible says, it goes with the Word.